In this video, we are going to be starting our chapters on biological molecules. To get things started, we're going to be talking about carbohydrates. We hope to see, as we go through these biochemistry chapters, the same functional groups that we saw earlier in the course and the same chemical reactions that we saw earlier in the course, just on biologically relevant molecules. The learning objectives for this carbohydrate chapter are listed here. You can pause the video if you want to read through these on your own. We will begin by talking about the structure and classification of monosaccharides. The learning objective for this particular video is to classify a carbohydrate as an aldose ketose and indicate the number of carbon atoms. Let's begin by talking about what carbohydrates actually are. The name carbohydrates comes from the original belief that these were hydrates of carbon. That means that they thought they had the chemical formula carbon with like water stuck to it. And if you look at the actual structure, you can see that it does have that kind of chemical formula where it's a carbon for every 2 H's and 1 O. So they originally thought to be hydrates of carbon, but then they found out it's not really bonded like that, and so the name just kind of stuck. They are also called saccharides, which means sugars, and that's exactly what they are. They are sugars. 65% of our diet because they are a major source of energy for humans. And carbohydrates can also be called polyhydroxyaldehydes. That means many OH aldehydes, meaning C double bond O OH, or polyhydroxyketones, meaning many alcohol ketones. You'll remember from our nomenclature chapters that if you have a higher priority functional group like aldehydes and ketones, then when alcohols are thrown into the prefix of a name, they are called hydroxy. The simplest carbohydrates are monosaccharides. Mono meaning one unit. So these are single molecule units. You can see that in the structure, there's always an aldehyde or a ketone. More on that shortly. Carbohydrates are very important for life. Plants make carbohydrates from the synthesis in order to store energy. And then animals do the opposite, where we consume sugars and things and undergo aerobic respiration in order to turn it into carbon dioxide and water and get energy out. So when we metabolize carbohydrates, we get energy out. And that's through oxidation reactions. More on that when we get into metabolism. Carbohydrates can also be stored in the form of like glycogen or other polysaccharides, and they are very important. And they also form the basis of our DNA, because the ribose sugar in RNA or the deoxyribose sugar in DNA is a ose, meaning it's a sugar. So let's talk about how we determine the structure of our monosaccharides. So monosaccharides are classified both by their number of carbons, what functional group it is, and that's pretty much it. So you're always going to have either an aldehyde at carbon number 1, or you're going to have a ketone at carbon number 2. Remember that aldehydes always are terminal, and ketones always occur somewhere in the middle of the chain. So aldehydes cannot occur at carbon number 2, and ketones cannot occur at carbon number 1. These are going to be functional group isomers of one another. That means that they will have the same chemical formula, but the difference will be the functional group they are in. So as long as they have the same number of carbons, then the aldose and the ketose forms of the sugar will be functional group isomers. You will have the general formula where you have, if N is the number of carbons, then you will have twice as many hydrogens and the same number of oxygens as you do carbons. All of these sugars have a suffix of ose. So for instance, glucose ends with ose, mannose also ends with ose, galactose, all of the sugars end with ose. All of the carbons that are not involved in the functional group will have OH groups on one OH group on all the other C's and then an H in order to give it 4 total bonds. So it's called an aldose if it has an aldehyde functional group, and it's called a ketose if it has a ketone functional group. That's how we name it if we're just naming it based on its functional group, but we can also classify it based on how many carbons it has. So if it has 3 carbons, then it would be a prefix of tri, and so that's a triose, meaning 3 carbon sugar. The prefix for 4 is tetra. Think of Tetris. Popular game where you had to make 4 rows of a kind. Or you had all these blocks that had 4 shapes. Or you can think tetrahedral. That's to remind you that it has 4 things. Pentose means 5 and hexose means 6. So those are similar to polygon prefixes like pentagon and hexagon. So those are pretty normal. We can combine these triose, tetrose, pentose, hexose vocabulary terms with the aldose and ketose forms before, and then you get things like an aldo triose, meaning aldehyde. I can't spell aldehyde right now. Three carbon sugar. And then a keto triose would mean ketone. 3 carbon sugar. Let's do a practice problem. Go ahead and pause the video and decide whether these are aldoses or ketoses, and then also classify them based on the number of carbons. Unpause the video when you're ready to check your work. Alright, so how many carbons does the first one have? These are Fisher projections, which means that there's also carbons at the intersections of all these points. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carbons. This says CHO, meaning aldehyde. So that is an aldopentose. This one is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's a ketone. And so this one in B is a ketohexose. This is another aldehyde. And so that's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this is an aldose hexose. This is a ketone. So D would be a keto. Then how many carbons is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's a ketopentose. Let's think about the physical properties of these monosaccharides, thinking about their structures. Monosaccharides typically do taste sweet, but their relative sweetness does vary. Would you expect the monosaccharides to have a high melting point? Why or why not? Would you expect them to be water soluble? Why or why not? Go ahead and pause the video, think about these. Think about your own knowledge about sugar in your kitchen, and unpause the video when you're ready to think and share your thinking with me. Okay, so we do expect the monosaccharides to have a relatively high melting point. Room temperature has not happened yet, and so the melting point is, if that's the melting point, and this is solids, this is the boiling point, these are liquids, and this is gas. A lot of sugars are solids at room temperature, which means that room temperature is here, and the melting point is above room temperature. That's going to be true because of the strong intermolecular forces possible between our monosaccharide molecules. Look at all the OH groups on there. That's going to have a lot of hydrogen bonding, both donating hydrogen bonding and accepting hydrogen bonding, because we have an H directly bonded to an O, and we have lone pairs on O's. And so that's a lot of crazy hydrogen bonding happening between these molecules. Would you expect monosaccharides to be water soluble? Why or why not? Well, you should know from cooking that sugar does dissolve in water, and that's because of all of the hydrogen bonding possible between the water molecules and our carbohydrate molecules. We can form hydrogen bonds between the two, and both can serve as both donors and acceptors of hydrogen bonds, and so that's a lot of forces happening there, and that's going to make them very water soluble.